Marcus Thompson held the gun with trembling hands as the bank teller pushed stacks of cash across the counter. But when he glanced down at the money in his briefcase, his blood turned to ice. Every single bill was counterfeit, and the tactical team's laser sights were already across his chest. The weight of failure pressed down on Marcus Thompson's shoulders as he stared at the position-filled sign taped to the diner's window. His 51st rejection in 3 months. His reflection in the grimy glass told a story he'd grown tired of seeing. A tall, lean man with deep-set eyes that had seen too much. Wearing his last clean shirt and carrying a folder full of rejection letters. Detroit's autumn wind whipped around him, carrying the scent of industrial smoke and dying dreams. 7 years behind bars had earned him an accounting degree and a promise of redemption. But the world outside seemed determined to remind him that some debts could never be repaid. "Hey, Marcus." Sarah Chun's voice cut through his thoughts. His parole officer stood across the street, her navy blazer flapping in the wind. She jogged over, narrowly avoiding a rusty pickup truck. "I was just heading to grab coffee. Join me?" Marcus hesitated. Sarah had been different from the start. No judgment in her eyes, just a steady determination to help him succeed. But today, with only $23 left in his wallet and an eviction notice waiting in his apartment, her optimism felt like salt in an open wound. "Sure," he managed, following her into Joe's coffee shop, a dingy establishment that had somehow survived Riveroo's economic decline. The bell above the door chimed weakly, announcing their entrance to the handful of regular customers who barely looked up from their phones and newspapers. The usual. "Sarah?" called Joe, an aging Vietnamese man who turned this corner of Detroit into his personal mission of caffeinated hope. "2 of them today, Joe," Sarah replied, leading Marcus to a corner booth where the cracked vinyl seats had been patched with duct tape. The table wobbled when he set down his folder. "I know that look," Sarah said, studying his face. "How many applications today?" 4, all dead ends. Marcus ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, a habit from prison he hadn't shaken. "I'm running out of options, Sarah." Joe brought their coffees. The ceramic mugs chipped but clean. The coffee's aroma provided a momentary escape from reality. "Listen," Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping. "I've got a lead at Anderson Accounting. They have a program for ex-cons?" Marcus cut in, bitterness seeping through. "Like the program at Miller's Hardware or Johnson Manufacturing? I'm tired of being someone's charitable tax write-off." Sarah's face softened. "You're more than your record, Marcus. Your test scores in prison were exceptional." "You tell that to my landlord," Marcus interrupted again, pulling the wrinkled eviction notice from his pocket. 3 days, Sarah. Then I'm out on the street." The silence that followed was filled with the hum of the ancient ceiling fan and the clinking of spoons against coffee cups. Through the window, Marcus watched a group of teenagers pass by, their laughter a reminder of a lightness he couldn't remember feeling. "There's the halfway house on Verner," Sarah suggested carefully. Marcus shook his head. Too many old faces there, too many old habits. He'd promised himself he wouldn't go back to that life, wouldn't disappoint Pastor Williams who'd visited him every month for 7 years, teaching him that redemption was possible. The pastor's words echoed in his mind. The hardest paths often lead to the most beautiful destinations. Right now, those words felt like fairy tales told to children. His phone buzzed. Another text from Tommy, his former cellmate. "Got a sweet deal lined up. Quick cash. You in?" Marcus deleted it without responding, but the temptation lingered like smoke in still air. Detective James O'Connor chose that moment to walk in, his weathered face breaking into recognition when he spotted Marcus. The detective had been instrumental in Marcus's case years ago, showing unexpected compassion during the arrest and trial. "Thompson," O'Connor nodded, ordering his coffee. "Staying out of trouble?" "Trying to," Marcus replied, watching the detective's reflection in the chrome napkin holder. 7 years ago, O'Connor had told him something that stuck. "It's not about where you've been, kid. It's about where you're heading." Right now, Marcus was heading nowhere, and time was running out. The weight of the accounting degree in his folder felt like lead, and the remaining $23 in his wallet might as well have been Monopoly money. as the afternoon light slanted through the coffee shop's windows, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. Marcus felt the walls of his world closing in. He'd played by the rules since his release, attended every parole meeting, submitted job applications daily, even volunteered at the community center where Pastor Williams ran his youth program. But the system seemed designed to push him back toward the very choices that had landed him in prison. Each rejection, each suspicious glance from potential employers, each "will call you" that never materialized pushed him closer to the edge of desperation. Sarah's voice pulled him back to the present. "Give me 2 more days," she said, determination etched in her features. "I have another contact at Citibank. They're progressive about second chances." Marcus nodded, not telling her about the plan already forming in his mind. Citibank's downtown branch. He'd been watching it for weeks, learning the security patterns, noting the camera's blind spots. One last job, he told himself, just enough to start over somewhere new, somewhere his past couldn't follow. The irony wasn't lost on him, potentially returning to prison for trying to avoid returning to prison. But as he watched the sun set over Detroit's scarred skyline, Marcus Thompson realized he was out of both options and time. What he didn't know then was that fate had a different plan for him, one that would test not just his desperation, but his very understanding of redemption. The fluorescent lights of Marcus's studio apartment buzzed like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across the water-stained walls. He sat on his threadbare mattress, surrounded by newspaper clippings of bank robberies, both successful and failed, spread out like a twisted career guidance manual. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd earned his accounting degree to understand money legitimately, and here he was, planning to take it by force. A knock at the door made him freeze. Through the peephole, he saw Pastor Williams's familiar silhouette. Marcus quickly swept the clippings under his mattress before opening the door. "Thought you might need dinner," the pastor said, holding up a paper bag that smelled of his wife's legendary pot roast. At 65, Williams still had the energy of a man half his age, though his hair had gone completely white during his 30 years of ministry in River Rouge. "You didn't have to," Marcus mumbled, but his growling stomach betrayed him. He hadn't eaten since yesterday's coffee with Sarah. "Sit," Williams commanded, making himself at home in the apartment's only chair. "Tell me what's really going on." Sarah called. Marcus's jaw tightened. Of course she had. "I'm fine, son. I've known you for 7 years." "Fine is what you say when you're anything but." Williams started unpacking the food. "Remember what you told me the first time I visited you in prison?" Marcus did. He'd been angry, bitter, convinced the pastor was just another do-gooder, looking to save a soul for heavenly brownie points. "I said I didn't need saving, and I told you, and everyone needs saving sometimes." Marcus finished, accepting a plate of food. "But this is different. I did everything right. Education, rehabilitation, positive attitude. The world doesn't care." Williams watched him eat for a moment. "You remember David Cooper?" Marcus paused mid-bite. Cooper had been another ex-con Williams worked with, a success story everyone talked about. What about him? Took him 80 months to find stable work. Now he runs the youth mentoring program at the center. "Change takes time, Marcus." "I don't have time," Marcus snapped, immediately regretting his tone. "Sorry, it's just the eviction." "I know about that too," Williams said quietly. "There's a spare room above the center. It's yours if you want it." The offer hung in the air, heavy with implications. The center was in the heart of his old neighborhood, where temptations and old connections lurked around every corner. Plus, he'd be under constant observation, a charity case on display. "I appreciate it, but pride is a luxury you can't afford right now." Williams cut in, his voice gentle but firm. "Sometimes the hand-up we need comes in a form we don't expect." Their conversation was interrupted by another knock. This time, it was Detective O'Connor, still in his work suit, looking grave. "Evening, Pastor," O'Connor nodded. "Thompson, can we talk?" Marcus's heart rate spiked. Had they somehow discovered his plans? But O'Connor's next words took him completely by surprise. "Tommy Reynolds was found dead an hour ago. Overdose." The detective watched Marcus carefully. "His phone showed multiple attempts to contact you recently. The pot roast turned to ash in Marcus's mouth. Tommy had been more than a cellmate. He'd been a friend, despite their different paths after release. The sweet deal he'd texted about earlier now took on a darker meaning. When? Marcus managed to ask. "Might puts it around noon today." O'Connor shifted his weight. "Look, I know you two were close inside. If you know anything about who he was working with," Marcus shook his head. "We hadn't really talked since release. Just some texts I ignored." The detective nodded, but his eyes said he didn't fully believe it. "Well, if you hear anything," he handed Marcus his card, a gesture that felt both professional and personal. After O'Connor left, Marcus sat in stunned silence. Williams stayed, his presence a quiet anchor in the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm Marcus. He was going to be a chef, Marcus finally said. Had this whole plan to open a restaurant when he got out. Called it second chances. He laughed bitterly. Guess some chances run out faster than others. Williams watched him with knowing eyes. "What was in those texts he sent you?" Marcus hesitated. "A job offer, not a legal one. And I deleted them." Marcus stood, pacing the small space. "But I've been thinking about something similar myself. Not drugs," he added quickly, seeing Williams's expression. "Just a way out." The pastor was quiet for a long moment. "There's always another way, Marcus. Sometimes we just need help seeing it." But Marcus barely heard him. Tommy's death had shaken something loose inside him. If he was going to act, it had to be soon, before he ended up like Tommy, or worse, back in prison for something stupid born of desperation. He spent that night studying blueprints of Citibank he'd obtained from public records, telling himself this wasn't a return to his old life, just a temporary deviation, a necessary evil. Yet every time he closed his eyes, he saw Tommy's face, heard his laugh echoing through prison corridors, felt the weight of promises made and broken. The next morning, Sarah called with news about the bank job she'd mentioned. Marcus listened politely, knowing he wouldn't be going to the interview. He had a different appointment at Citibank in mind, one that would either solve all his problems or create far worse ones. What he didn't know was that his carefully laid plans were about to collide with a truth that would force him to question everything. He thought he knew about second chances and redemption. The morning of the robbery dawned cold and gray, perfectly matching Marcus's state of mind. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror, methodically shaving away 3 days of stubble. The face staring back at him looked older than its 35 years, carved with lines of worry and sleepless nights. "Just like riding a bike," he muttered to himself, but his hands trembled slightly as he straightened his tie. The same one he'd worn to countless failed job interviews. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. He was finally putting his accounting knowledge to use, just not in the way his prison educators had intended. His phone buzzed. Another message from Sarah. "Interview at 2 p.m. Don't give up hope." He turned the phone off without responding. By 2 p.m., he'd either be long gone with enough money to start fresh somewhere else, or in handcuffs. There would be no middle ground. The bank occupied an old Art Deco building downtown, its marble facade weathered but still impressive. Marcus had chosen it carefully, smaller than the main branches, with an older security system and only 2 guards. He'd spent weeks watching, learning patterns, identifying vulnerabilities. The same attention to detail that had earned him top marks in accounting now served a darker purpose. He joined the morning crowd of customers, briefcase in hand, just another face in the sea of Detroit's walking wounded. The security guard nodded absently as he passed through the metal detector. Inside, the smell of lemon cleaning solution mixed with the musty scent of old money and desperation. Taking his place in line, Marcus studied the tellers behind their bulletproof glass. 3 women, all wearing the forced smiles of people who'd long ago stopped believing in the system they served. The irony of their shared disillusionment almost made him laugh. A child's cry caught his attention. A young mother struggled with a toddler near the deposit slips, her face showing the same strain Marcus had seen in his own mother's eyes years ago. The sight made his stomach clench. He hadn't told his mother about the eviction notice. Couldn't bear to see the disappointment in her eyes again. The line moved slowly. Each step forward felt like moving through molasses, his conscience wrestling with necessity. Pastor Williams's words echoed in his head. There's always another way. But Williams hadn't faced eviction with winter approaching, hadn't felt the walls closing in with each rejection letter. Next customer, please. Marcus approached the counter, his heart thundering against his ribs. The teller, her nameplate read Patricia, smiled mechanically. He slid the note across the counter, watching her eyes scan the words he'd carefully printed. Empty your drawer. No die packs. No alarms. Nobody gets hurt. Patricia's smile faltered, then disappeared entirely. Her hands moved to the cash drawer, trembling slightly. Marcus kept his face neutral, maintained eye contact, just as he'd practiced. The key was to appear calm, professional. Just another transaction in a day full of transactions. The money appeared in neat stacks. Marcus opened his briefcase, maintaining the facade of a routine deposit. As Patricia placed the last bundle in his case, something felt off. The bills looked different, newer, too new. A slight movement in his peripheral vision made him glance up. Through the glass, he saw Patricia's free hand move beneath the counter. The second guard, usually stationed by the door, was nowhere to be seen. Realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The money was fake, a training stack or part of some larger operation. He'd walked into something much bigger than a simple robbery. Time seemed to slow down. He had perhaps seconds to decide. The exit was 15 steps away. He could make it if he moved now. But running meant confirming guilt, meant throwing away any chance of explaining, meant, "Sir?" Patricia's voice brought him back. "Will there be anything else?" In that moment, Marcus Thompson made a decision that would alter the course of not just his life, but many others. He closed the briefcase with shaking hands, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. The second guard reappeared, speaking quietly into his radio. Through the bank's windows, Marcus caught a glimpse of movement, tactical units taking position. Whatever operation he'd stumbled into, it was much larger than his simple attempt at robbery. His options were evaporating by the second. Run and likely get shot. Stay and face certain arrest. Or, "Actually," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "I need to speak with the bank manager and probably Detective O'Connor from Major Crimes." Patricia's eyes widened slightly. He wasn't supposed to know that name. The pieces were starting to fall into place. The two new bills. The tactical response, O'Connor's presence at the coffee shop the other day. This wasn't just a bank. It was a trap. But for whom? As if on cue, the bank's doors burst open. But instead of SWAT teams, 3 masked men rushed in, weapons raised. Real robbers, walking right into what Marcus now realized was an elaborate sting operation. In the chaos that followed, Marcus made another choice, one that would either damn him forever or offer the redemption he'd been seeking all along. In the split second before chaos erupted, Marcus's accounting mind calculated odds with brutal efficiency. The fake money in his briefcase, the masked gunman, the undercover operation, all variables in an equation where survival meant making the right choice at exactly the right moment. Everybody down. The lead gunman's voice boomed through the bank's marble interior. Screams erupted as customers dropped to the floor. The young mother Marcus had noticed earlier clutched her toddler, trying to shield the child with her body. Marcus didn't move. His mind raced through scenarios, remembering every detail of the bank's layout he'd memorized during his weeks of planning. The security office was behind him, to the left. The break room had a back exit. The vault, briefcase. One of the gunmen pointed his weapon at Marcus. On the ground now, instead of complying, Marcus slowly raised his hands, keeping the briefcase visible. "You really don't want to do this," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent bank. "This isn't what you think it is." The gunman's eyes narrowed behind his mask. "Last warning." Marcus took a careful step forward. "The money's fake. All of it. This is a sting operation." He could feel Patricia's eyes boring into him from behind the counter. "You've got about 30 seconds before tactical units breach those doors." A second gunman swung his weapon toward Marcus. "He's bluffing. Take him out." But the lead gunman hesitated, just for a moment. That's when Marcus saw it. The slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted between Marcus and the exits. This wasn't a hardened criminal. This was someone desperate, just like him. "I can prove it," Marcus continued, slowly opening his briefcase. Look at the bills. Brand new sequential numbers. And there's something else you should know. The sound of breaking glass cut him off as smoke. Grenades crashed through the skylights. In the confusion that followed, Marcus made his move. He charged the nearest gunman, driving his shoulder into the man's solar plexus. The weapon clattered to the floor as they both went down. Shouts and gunfire erupted around them. Through the smoke, Marcus saw tactical teams breaching every entrance. But his focus was on the young mother and a child, still exposed in the middle of the floor. Using the fallen gunman's body as cover, he army crawled toward them. "Stay down," he shouted, reaching them just as a burst of gunfire sprayed overhead. Glass shattered somewhere behind them. The toddler's terrified wails pierced through the chaos. Marcus positioned himself between them and the gunfire, his body acting on instinct rather than thought. Through the thinning smoke, he could see Detective O'Connor leading a team through the main entrance, weapons raised. "Police, drop your weapons." The gunmen, realizing they were trapped, made one last desperate attempt. The leader turned his weapon toward Marcus and the civilians he was protecting. Time seemed to slow down. In that moment, Marcus saw himself in the gunman's eyes. The same desperation, the same feeling of being trapped by circumstance. But he also saw something else, a choice. The same choice he'd faced minutes earlier. "Don't," Marcus called out, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Your life isn't over yet. Don't make it be." For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, the gunman lowered his weapon. The others followed suit. As tactical teams swarmed in to secure them, Marcus stayed where he was, shielding the mother and child until he was sure it was safe. Detective O'Connor reached him first, his face a mix of surprise and something else. Respect, maybe. "Thompson," he said, helping Marcus to his feet. "Want to explain what you're doing here?" Marcus looked at the briefcase of fake money, then at the crying child being comforted by paramedics, and finally at the handcuffed gunman being led away. "Would you believe I came to make a deposit?" O'Connor's expression hardened. "Try again." "Okay," Marcus sighed, "but you might want to sit down for this one. And call Sarah Chun. She should hear it too." As the bank lobby transformed into a crime scene, Marcus Thompson prepared to tell a truth that would either condemn him or set him free. But for the first time in weeks, he felt something he hadn't expected: hope. In the bank's break room, now converted into a makeshift interrogation space, Marcus sat across from Detective O'Connor and Sarah Chun. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows on their faces. His untouched coffee grew cold as he recounted the events that had led him to this moment. "I started planning the robbery 3 weeks ago," he admitted, watching Sarah's face fall. "After the 50th rejection letter, I used my accounting knowledge to study the bank's patterns, security protocols. I thought I had it all figured out, but you didn't go through with it," O'Connor noted, his pen tapping against his notepad. "Even before the other crew showed up," Marcus nodded slowly. "The money in the drawer, I recognized it immediately. Sequential numbers. Too crisp, too new. 7 years inside teaches you things about currency you never wanted to know." Sarah leaned forward, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "Why didn't you just come to me? I told you I had leads." "Pride?" Marcus offered a bitter smile. "Fear? Take your pick. When you're an ex-con, asking for help feels like admitting failure. And failure," he trailed off, remembering Tommy's final texts. O'Connor cleared his throat. "About that crew that came in, we've been tracking them for months. They hit 3 other banks in the area. Professional jobs, in and out in under 5 minutes. Today was supposed to be our trap, until I walked in and nearly blew the whole operation," Marcus finished. "Actually," O'Connor corrected, "you may have saved it. They were too good, too careful. We needed something to throw them off their game. You provided that distraction." Sarah's phone buzzed. Pastor Williams asking about Marcus. She stepped out to take the call, leaving Marcus alone with the detective. "Here's what I don't get," O'Connor said, leaning back. "You had every opportunity to run during the initial confusion when the smoke grenades hit. Instead, you protected civilians and talked down an armed suspect." Marcus stared into his cold coffee, seeing his reflection in the dark liquid. "Maybe I'm tired of running." Tired of being the person everyone expects me to be. O'Connor was quiet for a long moment. The bank manager wants to press charges for attempted robbery. Marcus's heart sank. Of course, one good deed didn't erase an attempted crime. He'd be going back inside, this time with his accounting degree as a bitter souvenir of what could have been. However, O'Connor continued, given your actions during the incident and your potential value as a witness against the crew we caught, he pulled out a document from his briefcase. I've spoken with the DA. They're willing to make a deal. Sarah returned as Marcus was reading the agreement. His hands trembled slightly as he processed the words. Immunity? He looked up, disbelieving. In exchange for what? Your expertise, O'Connor explained. We've been trying to crack a massive counterfeiting operation. The bills you spotted today, part of it. We need someone who understands both sides of the game, the numbers and the streets. You want me to work for you? Marcus couldn't keep the incredulity from his voice. As a civilian consultant, Sarah interjected, under my supervision. It's not exactly the accounting job you wanted, but it's legitimate work, O'Connor finished. Using your skills to help instead of harm. Plus, the pay's better than what you get from a bank robbery. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Marcus. He'd walked into the bank intending to steal his future back. Instead, he was being offered a chance to earn it legitimately by helping catch people like the person he'd almost become. Through the break room window, he could see the young mother he protected, giving her statement to an officer. Her toddler was asleep in her arms, peaceful despite the chaos they'd endured. Something about that image, the resilience, the quiet strength, resonated deep within him. There's one condition, he said, turning back to O'Connor and Sarah. I want to help set up a program at the community center for ex-cons looking for legitimate work. No one should have to reach the point where robbery feels like their only option. Sarah smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her all day. I think Pastor Williams might have some ideas about that. As Marcus signed the agreement, he felt the weight of the past few weeks lifting from his shoulders. He wasn't naive enough to think everything would be easy from here. But for the first time since his release, he felt like he was moving forward instead of just running in place. Outside, Detroit's autumn wind had taken on a different character, less bitter, more cleansing. The sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the crime scene tape that still surrounded the bank. The weeks following the bank incident unfolded like chapters in a story Marcus could hardly believe he was living. His small apartment above the community center, Pastor Williams had insisted, despite his earlier reluctance, became command central for what O'Connor dubbed Operation Clean Slate. The irony of the name wasn't lost on Marcus. The wall above his desk bloomed with photos, documents, and financial records, all connected by red string like some television detective's investigation board. But these weren't just papers. They were pieces of a puzzle that had nearly claimed his own future. The counterfeiting operation goes deeper than we thought, he explained to Sarah during one of their weekly meetings. She sat on his only chair while he paced, connecting dots that had eluded law enforcement for months. They're not just printing money. They're using legitimate businesses to launder it. Look at these deposit patterns. He pointed to a series of bank statements. His accounting degree, once a seeming dead end, had become his sharpest tool. Small deposits, just under reporting thresholds. But the timing, it's too perfect. Someone's orchestrating this from inside the banking system. Sarah studied the patterns he'd identified. You seem different, she observed. More alive. Marcus paused his pacing. Having purpose helps, he admitted. Though some days I still wake up expecting this all to be a dream. A knock at the door interrupted. Patricia, the bank teller from the incident, stood in the hallway clutching a folder. Since the failed robbery, she'd become an unexpected ally, feeding information about suspicious transactions through official channels. You need to see this, she said, her usual professional demeanor cracking slightly. Remember those sequential bills? We found another batch. Different serial numbers, but the same paper stock. Marcus spread the new documents across his bed. His apartment wasn't exactly equipped for team meetings. As he studied the patterns, a chill ran down his spine. These came through Tommy's old contacts, he realized. The sweet deal he texted me about, He wasn't just using. He was their test run. The implications hit him hard. Tommy's death wasn't a simple overdose. It was a loose end being tied up. The same fate that might have awaited Marcus if he'd responded to those texts. Later that evening, alone in his apartment, Marcus heard familiar voices from the community center below. Pastor Williams was holding his weekly support group for ex-offenders. The sound of shared struggles and hopes drifted up through the floorboards, a reminder of both where he'd been and what he was fighting for now. He thought about Tommy, about the dreams they'd shared in their cell. Second chances, the restaurant that would never open. But maybe Marcus realized he could give Tommy's dream a different kind of life. The next morning, he presented his idea to Pastor Williams. The community center's kitchen, unused except for holiday events, could become a training ground. Ex-offenders learning culinary skills, building legitimate careers. Tommy's vision transformed from a personal dream to a community lifeline. It's not just about cooking, Marcus explained, watching the pastor's eyes light up with understanding. It's about creating something honest with your hands, something that feeds people's bodies and souls. William smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he'd been waiting for Marcus to have exactly this revelation. Tommy would be proud, he said simply. The pastor's words stayed with Marcus as he drove to meet O'Connor at their usual spot, a diner far from both the community center and police headquarters. The detective was already there, nursing his perpetual coffee and looking more tired than usual. "We've got movement," O'Connor said without preamble. "Your intel about the paper stock paid off. Traced it to a supplier in Canada. But here's the thing, the supplier's clean. Someone's hijacking their shipments between the factory and the banks." Marcus absorbed this information, his mind already racing through implications. They'd need someone on both ends. Someone who knows shipping schedules, security protocols. Someone like an accountant, O'Connor finished. Someone who understands the system from the inside. The weight of what they were uncovering pressed down on Marcus. This wasn't just about fake money anymore. It was about corruption at every level. About people in positions of trust betraying that trust for profit. People who, unlike him, had never faced the consequences of their choices. As they discussed next steps, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Need you at the center. Emergency." Something in her tone made his pulse quicken. He showed the message to O'Connor, who was already reaching for his keys. "Let's go," the detective said, throwing cash on the table. "I've got a feeling these cases might be more connected than we thought." As they drove through Detroit's darkening streets, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that everything, the failed robbery, Tommy's death, the counterfeiting operation, was converging towards something bigger than any of them had imagined. The community center parking lot was filled with unfamiliar vehicles when Marcus and O'Connor arrived. Sarah stood at the entrance, her usual composed demeanor replaced by barely contained urgency. "Someone broke into the center's financial records," she said without preamble. But they weren't looking for money. They were looking for names. Inside, Pastor Williams sat at his desk, looking older than Marcus had ever seen him. Scattered papers covered every surface, and the filing cabinet's lock had been professionally picked. The program records, Marcus realized, his blood running cold. All our ex-offenders' employment information, their new workplaces, their access to bank accounts, financial systems, legitimate businesses. O'Connor added, the pieces falling into place. Perfect cover for moving counterfeit money. Marcus picked up a file, Tommy's old intake form. Something clicked in his mind, a connection he should have seen earlier. Tommy wasn't just a test run. He was their recruiter. They were using him to identify potential assets. And when he had second thoughts, O'Connor prompted. They eliminated the risk. Marcus's voice was tight with anger. Now they're looking for new recruits. Desperate people with financial system access and nothing left to lose. Sarah was already on her phone, coordinating with other parole officers to warn their clients. But Marcus knew it might be too late for some. He thought of the faces from Williams's support group, of people fighting for legitimate second chances, now being targeted because of their vulnerability. "There's more," Williams said quietly, holding up a paper. "This was left on my desk." Marcus took the note. his hands trembling slightly as he read, "Some debts can't be paid with honest work." Ask Thompson. The threat was clear. They knew about his attempted robbery, knew he was working with law enforcement, but something about the phrasing nagged at the bank, he said suddenly. The day of the robbery. It wasn't just a sting operation for those armed robbers, was it? O'Connor's silence was answer enough. "You knew I was planning something," Marcus continued, the truth dawning on him. "The fake money, the tactical team. You were waiting for me. We had intel about multiple potential robbers," O'Connor admitted, "but we didn't expect you to recognize the counterfeit bills or to risk your life protecting civilians." Marcus leaned against the desk, processing this revelation. "So everything, the consultant job, the investigation, it was all just a way to keep me controlled, under surveillance?" "At first," Sarah interjected, "but you proved yourself to be more than just an ex-con looking for redemption. You became essential to the investigation." Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed. An unknown number, but the message made his heart stop. "Your mother says hello. Want to discuss old debts?" Attached was a photo of his mother's house, taken within the last hour. The room spun, everything he'd built over the past weeks. The investigation, the community center program, his shot at redemption, suddenly felt like a house of cards in a hurricane. "They're not just threatening me anymore," he said, showing the message to O'Connor. "They're going after everyone I care about." The detective was already calling for a patrol car to check on Marcus's mother, but they all knew it was just the beginning. "You need to disappear," O'Connor said. "Protective custody until we can." "No." Marcus's voice was firm. "Running won't protect anyone, and it won't stop them from exploiting other ex-cons who are just trying to rebuild their lives." He looked around the room, at Sarah, who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself, at Pastor Williams, who had shown him the power of true redemption, at O'Connor, who had given him a chance to be more than his past mistakes. "I have a different idea," he said, "but you're not going to like it." The plan that formed in his mind was dangerous, possibly suicidal. But as he looked at Tommy's file one more time, he knew it was the only way to end this. Not just for himself, but for everyone caught in the crossfire between desperation and exploitation. "Whatever you're thinking," Sarah started, but Marcus cut her off. "Sometimes," he said, echoing Pastor Williams's words from what felt like a lifetime ago, "the hardest paths lead to the most beautiful destinations." The light fading outside cast long shadows through the community center windows, like bars across the floor, a reminder of what was at stake and what he stood to lose. Marcus's plan unfolded in the pre-dawn hours of the next morning. He sat in his apartment above the community center, composing a message that would either save everyone he cared about or destroy everything he built. "I want in," he typed to the unknown number that had threatened his mother. "You're right about honest work. Let's talk about real opportunities." The response came faster than he expected. "Smart choice. Pier 23, midnight. Come along." O'Connor had argued against it for hours. "It's too risky. We don't have enough backup in place. If they realize you're working with us." But Marcus knew this was their only shot. The counterfeiters needed someone with his specific background, accounting knowledge, criminal experience, and access to a network of desperate ex-cons through the community center. Sarah sat across from him now, helping him prepare for the meeting. "Your wire is undetectable," she explained, though her hand shook slightly as she adjusted it. "But if anything feels wrong, I get out," Marcus finished. "I know," but they both knew he wouldn't. Not with his mother's safety on the line, not with Tommy's killers still free, not with dozens of vulnerable ex-offenders at risk of being pulled into a scheme that would destroy their chances at legitimate lives. Pastor Williams had spent the day evacuating the community center, moving support group members to safe locations. The sight of their faces, confused, scared, but trusting in the system they'd worked so hard to rejoin, strengthened Marcus's resolve. "The restaurant program," he told Williams before leaving. "If this goes wrong, we'll be waiting for you when you succeed." The pastor interrupted firmly. "God didn't bring you this far to abandon you now." As midnight approached, Marcus drove through Detroit's empty streets. The city felt different at night, more honest about its scars, its struggles, its stubborn hope. Like him, it was a place trying to rebuild itself in the shadow of past mistakes. Pier 23 loomed ahead, a maze of shipping containers and forgotten dreams. Marcus parked where instructed, noting the escape routes O'Connor had drilled into it. The wire beneath his shirt felt like a lifeline to a world he might never see again. A figure emerged from between the containers. Patricia, the bank teller. Marcus's heart sank as another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Surprised? She asked, her professional demeanor replaced by something harder. Don't be. 7 years of watching people like you try to game the system taught me something. The real money's in controlling the game. More figures emerged from the shadows. Marcus recognized some faces from bank security footage, others from case files. At their center stood a man he knew all too well, the bank's regional director, James Morrison. Thompson, Morrison nodded. Impressive work spotting our test bills. Even more impressive talking down those robbers. Shows you understand both sides of the equation. Marcus forced himself to stay calm, remembering O'Connor's coaching. Money's money, he said. Doesn't matter which side of the law it comes from. I learned it the hard way, Morrison smiled. The same smile he probably used in board meetings. We're not criminals, Marcus. We're entrepreneurs. The system's rigged anyway. We just level the playing field. By exploiting ex-cons? Marcus couldn't keep the edge from his voice. By killing Tommy when he wanted out? Business requires sacrifice, Morrison shrugged. Tommy wasn't reliable. You are. Your background, your skills, your position at the community center. You're perfect for what we need. Patricia stepped forward, holding out a briefcase. Consider this your signing bonus. Real money this time. Marcus took the briefcase, his mind racing. They were offering him everything he'd once thought he wanted. Money, power, revenge against a system that had rejected him. All it would cost was his soul. He thought of Tommy's dreams of his restaurant, of Pastor Williams's unwavering faith, of Sarah's belief in redemption, of his mother, waiting at home, still proud of her son, despite everything. When do we start? He asked, knowing his next words would set everything in motion. The words that followed would change everything. First, Marcus said, opening the briefcase. Let's talk about how you've been using Community Trust Bank to launder your counterfeits. Morrison's smile faltered slightly. Careful, Thompson. Some questions are better left unasked, like why certain tellers were instructed to accept large cash deposits without filing reports. Marcus continued, watching Patricia's face, or why the bank's internal audits kept missing obvious patterns. Your homework, Morrison acknowledged. Good. That's exactly why we need you. But Marcus wasn't finished. Tommy figured it out, didn't he? Not just the counterfeiting, but the whole operation. The bank's involvement, the community center files, everything. That's why he had to die. The atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Steel containers creaked in the night wind, their shadows dancing like prison bars across the pier. You should be more concerned about your mother's safety than ancient history, Morrison said coldly. Marcus smiled for the first time that night. Funny you should mention that. She's having dinner with Detective O'Connor's family. Something about witness protection? Morrison's composed facade cracked. Check the perimeter. He barked to his men. Now. Oh, and those community center files you stole? Marcus continued, gaining momentum. Interesting reading, especially the parts about which banks handle our clients' accounts. Almost like someone wanted to target specific branches for their operation. Patricia moved toward him, her hand reaching beneath her jacket. You're making a mistake. No, Marcus said firmly. The mistake was thinking desperation would make me betray everything I've built. Everything Tommy died trying to protect. The sound of police sirens pierced the night. Morrison's face contorted with rage. Kill him. But Marcus was already moving. The briefcase swung up, catching Patricia's gun hand as she drew. Years of prison workouts paid off as he grappled with her, keeping her between himself and Morrison's other men. Detroit police, freeze! O'Connor's voice boomed through a megaphone as tactical teams emerged from behind containers. The pier erupted in chaos. Morrison turned to run but found Pastor Williams blocking his path, the old man's presence as immovable as his faith. Going somewhere, James? Sarah appeared from the shadows, her badge gleaming. James Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy, money laundering, and the murder of Thomas Reynolds." As handcuffs clicked around wrists and rights were read, Marcus stood in the center of it all, his wire having captured every incriminating word. The operation that had nearly claimed his soul was crumbling, but something stronger was rising from its ruins. Patricia, caught between officers, spat words at him. "You could have had everything." "I already do," Marcus replied quietly. Later, as dawn broke over the Detroit River, Marcus sat in O'Connor's office, giving his statement. The evidence they'd gathered would dismantle not just Morrison's counterfeiting ring, but expose corruption throughout multiple banks. "The community center files," O'Connor said. "You knew they'd lead us to the corrupt branches?" Marcus nodded. "When Tommy died, he left me a message I didn't understand until now. His restaurant dream wasn't just about second chances. It was about building something honest from the ground up, something they couldn't corrupt." Sarah entered with coffee and news. "The DA's office is offering plea deals to the smaller players. Morrison's going away for a long time. And the bank? They're facing federal investigations." "And the community center?" Marcus asked. Sarah smiled. "Officially recognized as a rehabilitation success story. The restaurant training program is getting full funding. Tommy's dream lives on." Pastor Williams appeared in the doorway, looking tired but satisfied. "Ready to go home, son?" Marcus stood, feeling the weight of the past 24 hours, of the past 7 years, finally lifting. "Yeah," he said, "I think I am." 3 months after the pier incident, Marcus stood in the gleaming kitchen of Second Chances. No longer just a dream, but a thriving culinary training program at the community center. The sound of chopping, sizzling, and eager voices filled the air as former inmates learned the art of professional cooking. "Watch that flame, Jerry," he called out to a young man managing the grill. "Remember what Chef Martinez taught us about heat control?" The professional chef they'd hired was a mentor, not just in cooking, but in life, himself a product of a similar program years ago. The windows of the renovated space offered a view of Detroit's skyline, where the morning sun painted possibilities across steel and glass. The city, like its people, was transforming itself one day at a time. Sarah visited regularly, not just as a parole officer, but as a proud supporter. Today, she sat at the tasting counter, sampling their latest creations. "The board's impressed," she said between bites. 3 successful job placements last month alone. 4 now, Marcus corrected, sliding over a letter. "Miller's Restaurant downtown wants 2 more of our graduates. Full benefits, real career path." The success of Second Chances had exceeded even their optimistic projections. Local restaurants, initially skeptical, now competed for their graduates. Each success story helped erase the stigma that had once seemed permanent. O'Connor appeared occasionally too, though today he came with purpose. "The feds finished their audit," he reported quietly. 17 banks involved in the counterfeiting ring. "Morrison's cooperation is bringing down players we didn't even know existed." Marcus nodded, watching his students work. Each of them had stories similar to his moments where desperation had nearly won, where the wrong choice had seemed like the only choice. Now they were writing new chapters, armed with skills and support. "Tommy would have loved this," he said, gesturing to the bustling kitchen. "It's exactly what he imagined, right down to the training stations." Pastor Williams, who had become a daily fixture, smiled from his favorite corner spot. "He sees it," the older man said simply. Through all of them, the center support groups now included financial literacy training, job placement assistance, and mentorship programs. Marcus's accounting skills finally found their intended use, helping others understand and navigate legitimate financial systems. His mother visited often, proudly watching her son teach and lead. The fear that had shadowed her eyes since his first arrest was gone, replaced by a quiet joy. She'd even started teaching a baking class on weekends. As evening approached and the kitchen wound down, Marcus gathered his students for their daily reflection, a practice borrowed from Pastor Williams. "Remember," he told them, "every meal you create is more than food. It's proof that change is possible, that society's labels don't define us, that second chances aren't just dreams. They're rights we earn through honest work and dedication. Later, alone in his office, once just a storage room, Marcus updated the graduation board. 28 names now, each representing a life transformed. Tommy's photo watched over them from a frame above. His dream multiplied 28 times and growing. Sarah found him there, lost in thought, still coming to terms with it all. Sometimes, he admitted, I wake up thinking I'm back in that cell, or standing in that bank with the fake money, or on that pier making the hardest choice of my life. But then I hear them out there. He gestured to the kitchen where a few students were cleaning up, laughing over shared stories. And I remember why we do this. The sun was setting over Detroit, painting the sky in colors that reminded Marcus of hope. In his pocket, he carried his newest business card, Marcus Thompson, Executive Director, Second Chance's Culinary Program. The title meant less to him than the lives being changed within these walls. You know what Tommy used to say? He asked Sarah. Every great meal starts with a single ingredient. He meant more than cooking. He meant life, how small choices, honest choices, build into something bigger. As they locked up for the night, Marcus paused to look at the sign they'd hung just last week. Second Chance's Culinary Institute, in memory of Thomas Reynolds. Below it, in smaller letters, was the motto they'd chosen together, where past mistakes become future mastery. Detroit's streets were quiet as Marcus drove home, but not threatening anymore. The city, like him, had learned that redemption isn't a destination, but a journey. One meal, one choice, one life at a time. In his rearview mirror, the community center's lights glowed like a beacon. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new chances to prove that the hardest paths truly did lead to the most beautiful destinations. Marcus Thompson smiled, finally at peace with his place in the world. He was no longer running from his past or toward an uncertain future. He was exactly where he needed to be, helping others find their way home, one honest choice at a time. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to support us by leaving a like and subscribing to our Slices of Life channel. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Which city are you talking about? It's very rewarding for us to provide our followers with an enjoyable moment. We appreciate the unconditional support you show us in every story. Blessings!